Close your eyes now and let your mind drift back through time, back to a world where the simple act of seasoning food held the power to change everything. Tonight we'll travel together on a journey through history, following the gentle trail of tiny seeds, delicate bark, and fragrant leaves that somehow managed to set the entire world in motion. These were not grand armies or mighty kings, but simple plants growing quietly in distant corners of our world, holding within them such extraordinary power that nations would rise and fall in their pursuit. Imagine, if you will, a time before refrigeration, before modern medicine, when the world was vast and mysterious, and most of what lay beyond the horizon was unknown. A time when the night sky stretched endlessly above, unmarred by city lights, where stars guided travelers, and the moon marked the passage of months in its eternal dance. In this ancient world, spices were not merely flavor enhancers. They were treasures beyond measure, miracles of nature that could transform the mundane into something magical. Each tiny seed, each fragment of bark, each dried flower held within it the promise of transformation. Picture a healer in ancient Mesopotamia grinding cinnamon bark into a fine powder, believing it held the power to cure the sick, to ease pain, to bridge the gap between the mortal world and the divine. The mortar and pestle, worn smooth by generations of use, the rhythmic grinding, becoming almost a meditation, a prayer offered to gods, whose names we've long forgotten. These precious substances, these gifts from distant lands, were first valued not for their taste, but for their ability to preserve life itself. In a world where death walked closely beside every living person, where illness could strike without warning and claim entire families, these aromatic treasures represented hope, fragile and precious like morning dew. In the scorching heat of the ancient world, before ice, before proper storage, food spoiled quickly. The wealthy, the fortunate ones, would mask the bitter taste of decay with precious spices brought from lands they could not even imagine, lands where they believed the sun burned hotter, where trees grew taller, and where the very air hummed with magic. But even more than preservation, spices held sacred power. In the great temples of Egypt, where massive columns rose toward the heavens and hieroglyphs told stories of gods and kings, priests would burn frankincense and myrrh, sending sweet smoke curling up toward the heavens, carrying prayers and hopes and dreams to the gods above. The smoke would rise slowly, gracefully, spiraling upward, catching the light, streaming through high windows, transforming into something almost alive, almost sentient, as it ascended toward the realm of the divine. The Egyptians, with their deep reverence for the afterlife, with their belief that death was not an ending, but a transformation, would wrap their pharaohs in linen soaked with cinnamon and cassia, believing that these aromatic treasures would guide the royal souls safely to the next world. They would spend months preparing a single body, treating it with precious oils, wrapping it in hundreds of yards of fine linen, placing amulets of gold and lapis lazuli between the layers, each step performed with reverence, each gesture heavy with meaning. Cleopatra herself, the last pharaoh, whose beauty became legend, whose intelligence shaped the fate of empires, would bathe in milk scented with precious saffron, each golden thread worth more than its weight in gold, making her skin glow with an otherworldly radiance. Imagine her reclining in her bath, the warm milk infused with thousands of delicate saffron threads, each one hand-picked from purple crocus flowers that bloomed for only a few precious weeks each autumn. The labor of harvesting this most precious spice was staggering, requiring 70,000 flowers to produce a single pound. But how did these magical substances reach the ancient world? The answer lies in the first brave souls who dared to venture into the unknown. Men and women who looked beyond the familiar horizons and wondered what mysteries, what treasures lay waiting in distant lands. Long before great ships crossed vast oceans, there were smaller journeys, quieter expeditions along ancient pathways that connected distant lands like delicate threads in an invisible tapestry. These routes, carved by countless feet over countless generations, wound through mountains, crossed deserts, and bridged the gaps between different worlds. In the lush mountains of Kerala, in southern India, where monsoon rains fall with such force that they seem to hammer the very earth, black pepper grew wild, its tiny berries holding within them a heat and fire that would drive men to madness with desire. The pepper vines, climbing high into the forest canopy, were guarded by local communities who understood their immense value. These communities had cultivated and traded pepper for thousands of years, long before foreign merchants ever arrived on their shores. Arab traders, wise and secretive masters of navigation who could read the stars as easily as we read books, would travel these dangerous routes through scorching deserts where the sun beat down with merciless intensity, and treacherous mountain passes where a single misstep could send a caravan tumbling into oblivion, carrying precious cargo that was worth more than gold. They guarded their secrets carefully. These early merchants, understanding that knowledge was power and mystery was profit. They spinning tales of dragons, breathing fire and smoke, and giant birds with wingspans wider than ships that supposedly guarded the cinnamon trees in far-off lands. They spoke of valleys shrouded in perpetual mist, where deadly serpents, as thick as a man's thigh, coiled around pepper vines, their fangs dripping with venom so potent that a single drop could kill instantly, and of cliffs so high that they pierced the clouds, where only the bravest hunters, armed with courage and desperation, could retrieve the precious cassia bark from nests built by mythical creatures, half bird, half demon. These stories, fantastic as they were, woven with such detail, told with such conviction, served a purpose. They kept others away from the true sources, ensuring that the Arab traders remained the sole gatekeepers of these precious treasures. Mystery, they understood, was the best guardian of monopoly. And so, for centuries, the spice trade remained a carefully guarded secret, flowing slowly like honey from a distant hive into the ancient world. The routes themselves became sacred, passed down from father to son, each generation, adding their knowledge, their experience, their stories to the collective wisdom. As empires rose and fell, as great cities turned to dust and were swallowed by sand and time, one power emerged that would transform the spice trade forever and create a hunger that would reshape the world. Rome, the Roman Empire, in all its glory, in all its magnificent excess, developed an appetite for luxury that knew no bounds. And at the center of this magnificent obsession was a small, wrinkled black berry that would become known as black gold, pepper. To understand the Roman obsession with spices, imagine walking through the streets of ancient Rome at the height of its power. The city, teeming with nearly 1 million souls, was the largest, most complex, most sophisticated urban center the world had ever seen. The air thick with smoke from countless cooking fires, from sacrificial altars, from the furnaces of bathhouses that heated water for thousands of bathers every single day. The wealthy citizens, in their flowing togas, edged with purple, signaling their status, demanding that their food be seasoned with the finest spices from the farthest corners of the known world. A single pound of black pepper could cost as much as a year's wages for a common laborer. Imagine that, an entire year of backbreaking work, of rising before dawn, of returning home after sunset, all for a single pound of dried berries. Yet the demand never ceased, never wavered. Roman matrons, wealthy women who managed great households, would hoard pepper like precious jewels, storing it in locked boxes of silver and bronze, using it not only in cooking, but as currency itself. They would count their peppercorns the way others counted coins, each one a small fortune, each handful a treasure. They would grind it into their wine, believing it enhanced the flavor and the effect of the alcohol. They would sprinkle it on their fruit, on their roasted meats, on their elaborate dishes of dormice and peacock tongues, and other delicacies that spoke of their wealth and status. Some believed, truly believed, that consuming pepper would grant them eternal youth and vitality. They saw, in these tiny seeds from distant India, a kind of magic, a power that could slow the inevitable march of time. The wealthy of the wealthy would even, it is said, bathe in water infused with pepper and other spices, hoping that their skin would absorb the life-giving properties they believed these substances contained. The wealth that flowed from Rome to the distant spice lands was staggering. Historians estimate that Rome sent millions of gold coins eastward every single year, draining the empire of its precious metal in exchange for these aromatic treasures. Ships would arrive at Roman ports, particularly Ostia, the great harbor that served Rome, heavy with silk and gold, ready to trade for these tiny treasures that grew in places Romans could barely imagine. The docks would bustle with activity as workers unloaded precious cargo, while merchants argued over prices and customs officials calculated taxes. But the Arabs, these masters of the trade, these keepers of secrets, maintained their monopoly through more than just mythical stories. They maintained it through expertise, through relationships, through an understanding of the routes that no one else possessed. Picture caravans winding slowly across endless deserts under stars that seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light, guiding travelers through the darkness. Each journey was a dance with death itself. Sandstorms that could appear without warning, turning day into night, burying entire caravans beneath tons of sand. Bandits lurking behind every dune, waiting to descend on unsuspecting merchants and steal the fortunes they carried. And the constant threat of running out of water in the merciless heat, where the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, where men's lips would crack and bleed, where dehydration could kill within days. Yet they persisted, these brave merchants, these desert navigators, because they knew that a successful journey could make them wealthier than kings. A single trip, surviving all the dangers, could set up an entire family for generations. The Arab traders developed an intricate network of relationships and alliances. They spoke multiple languages, Arabic and Persian, Greek and Aramaic, adapting their speech to each new trading partner. They understood different cultures, knew which gifts would please which kings, which customs must be observed in which cities. And most importantly, they never revealed the true sources of their precious cargo. This was the golden rule, the unbreakable law of their trade. The mystery must be maintained at all costs. When Romans asked, with genuine curiosity, where the cinnamon came from, the Arabs would weave tales of distant lands, where giant birds, called cinnamons, built their nests from cinnamon bark high atop unreachable cliffs. They described in vivid detail how brave hunters would leave chunks of meat, heavy slabs of ox or donkey, at the base of these cliffs and wait, patient and silent, for the birds to carry the meat up to their nests, only to have the nests collapse under the weight, sending precious cinnamon cascading down to be gathered by the patient hunters below. These stories, passed down through generations, told and retold around countless campfires, became so embedded in Roman culture that even the greatest scholars, men like Pliny the Elder, who sought to catalog all knowledge, accepted them as truth. They wrote them down in their encyclopedias, preserving them for future generations who would wonder at the credulity of their ancestors. But empires, like all things, like mountains worn down by wind and rain, like mighty trees, eventually hollowed by time, must eventually come to an end. As the Western Roman Empire began its slow decline through internal corruption, through barbarian invasions, through economic collapse, the carefully maintained trade routes that had brought spices to European tables started to crumble. The great roads that had connected Rome to the world, those engineering marvels that allowed armies to march swiftly and merchants to travel safely, fell into disrepair. Without the empire's resources, without the legions to maintain them, the roads became impassable, overgrown with weeds, their stones stolen by locals for their own building projects. The naval fleets that had protected merchant vessels from pirates and raiders were disbanded. Without protection, without organized convoys, merchant ships became easy prey for those who lived by robbery and violence. And slowly, inevitably, like a river drying up in a drought, the flow of spices to Europe began to slow to a trickle, then to nothing. For centuries, Europe would enter what some call the Dark Ages, though historians now question that term, recognizing that much light remained. But it was undeniably a time when the flavors of the East became nothing more than distant memories, preserved only in the writings of ancient scholars. Old men would tell young children about the time when their grandfathers had tasted pepper, had smelled cinnamon, and the children would listen wide-eyed, believing they heard fairy tales of magical substances from imaginary lands. But memory has a way of keeping dreams alive. Even in the darkest times, even when all seems lost, memory persists, like embers buried beneath ash, waiting to be fanned into flame once more. Deep in the mists of medieval Europe, in monasteries, perched on remote hillsides, where monks dedicated their lives to prayer and preservation, and castle libraries, where knowledge was guarded, like gold scribes carefully preserved the ancient recipes and tales of distant spices. They wrote of cinnamon and ginger, of nutmeg and cloves, with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. They illustrated their manuscripts with careful drawings of plants they had never seen, working from descriptions passed down through centuries, adding their own imagination to fill the gaps. And then, like dawn breaking over a sleeping world, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter snow, came the Crusades. These religious wars, intended to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, would unexpectedly reawaken Europe's appetite for the treasures of the East. Not through conquest, but through contact, through the inevitable exchange. that happens when different cultures meet. Picture a knight returning from the dusty roads of the Middle East, his armor worn, dented and scarred by countless battles, his horse weary, its head hanging low with exhaustion, but in his saddlebags, something precious. Small cloth pouches, tied with leather strings, containing mysterious powders and dried leaves that carried scents unlike anything he had ever experienced in his European homeland. Scents that reminded him of markets in Damascus, of gardens in Jerusalem, of the strange, beautiful, exotic world he had encountered beyond the Mediterranean. These returning crusaders brought with them not just stories of distant battles, of sieges and victories, of defeats and retreats, but samples of cinnamon so sweet and warm that it seemed to contain the very essence of paradise. They carried ginger that could warm a person's very soul on the coldest winter evening, and tiny vials carefully wrapped to protect their precious contents of what they called the golden spice saffron, so precious that just a pinch could transform an entire meal, turn simple bread into something worthy of a king. Word spread quickly through the courts and castles of Europe. The wealthy, the powerful, the nobles who competed constantly for status and prestige began to crave these exotic flavors with an intensity that bordered on obsession. To serve spiced dishes at your banquet was to demonstrate your wealth, your connections, your importance. To have cinnamon in your kitchen was to proclaim to the world that you mattered. And into this world of renewed desire, of reawakened appetite, stepped a city that would become the greatest trading empire the world had ever seen. A city that would grow from muddy islands into a jewel of unimaginable beauty and wealth. Venice, built upon islands in a shallow lagoon where the land met the sea. In an uncertain embrace, Venice seemed an unlikely place to become the center of global commerce. The city rose from the water like a dream, like something that shouldn't exist at all. But the Venetians were nothing if not clever, born into a world where they had no fertile land, no natural resources, no obvious advantages. They learned to make their fortune from trade, from connections, from the movement of goods between East and West. They understood that geography could be destiny. Situated perfectly between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, between the world they knew and the world they dreamed of, Venice could serve as the bridge between two worlds, the hinge on which the door swung between civilizations. Venetian merchants, young men with fire in their eyes and gold in their hearts, and an understanding that fortune favors the bold, began making journeys to Alexandria, the great Egyptian port, and Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, establishing relationships with the same Arab traders who had once served the Roman Empire. These partnerships, built on mutual trust, mutual benefit, and enormous profit, would transform Venice from a collection of muddy islands where fishermen hauled their nets into the most magnificent city in Europe. A place of such beauty, such wealth, such power, that visitors would gasp in wonder as they arrived. Imagine walking through the Rialto market in Venice at the height of its power. The year is perhaps 1400, and Venice stands at the center of the world. The air thick with the scent of distant lands. Cinnamon and nutmeg, cloves and pepper, mixing with the salt smell of the lagoon with the aroma of fresh bread, baking in countless ovens with perfumes from Arabia and incense from Jerusalem. Merchants calling out in a dozen languages, Italian and Greek, Arabic and German, French and Spanish, their stalls overflowing with pepper, piled high like black snow, and cinnamon, stacked in neat bundles, nutmeg, displayed like jewels, and cloves that looked like tiny nails, each spice more precious than gold. Venetian palaces rose from the lagoon like fairy tale castles, their walls built, quite literally, with the profits from the spice trade. Each palazzo was a statement of wealth and power, its facade decorated with marble brought from distant quarries, its windows glazed with glass from Venetian workshops, its rooms filled with treasures from around the world. The Doge's palace, the seat of Venetian government, with its pink and white marble, its golden decorations, its Gothic arches, and impossible delicacy, stood as a testament to the power that could be built on tiny seeds and fragrant bark. It was quite literally a palace built on pepper. But Venice's monopoly came with a price. Every spice that entered Europe had to pass through Venetian hands. Every transaction enriched Venetian coffers. The Venetians became the gatekeepers, the middlemen who controlled the flow of these precious goods. A pound of pepper that cost 1 gold coin in Alexandria, where Arab merchants sold their goods, would cost 10 by the time it reached London or Paris. And most of that markup flowed into Venetian pockets. This enormous markup created tremendous wealth for Venice, but it also planted seeds of resentment in the hearts of other European nations. Why? They asked themselves, why should Venice control their access to these precious treasures? In the courts of Portugal and Spain, in the palaces where kings met with their advisors, where maps were studied by candlelight and dreams of empire were hatched, kings and advisors began to dream of finding their own route to the spice lands. Why should Venice, an upstart city, control their access to these precious treasures? Why should Venetian merchants grow rich, fat, and comfortable from their desire for exotic flavors? Surely there must be another way. These questions, whispered in royal chambers, discussed in hushed tones, over wine and roasted meats, would soon become the driving force behind the greatest age of exploration the world had ever seen. An age when men would risk everything, sail into the unknown, face death at every turn, all for the promise of pepper and cloves. In the Kingdom of Portugal, a small nation clinging to the edge of Europe, looking out toward the vast Atlantic, a young prince with dreams larger than his small nation began to imagine the impossible. Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, though he himself never sailed on any of the great voyages he sponsored, gazed out from his palace in Sagres at the southwestern tip of Portugal toward the vast Atlantic and wondered, what if there was another way to reach the lands where precious spices grew? What if, by sailing south along the coast of Africa, following the continent, wherever it led, a brave navigator could eventually find a route around the great continent and into the spice-rich waters of the East? It was an audacious dream, an impossible dream, many said. The African coast stretched endlessly into unknown waters. No European had ever sailed more than a few hundred miles down that coast. Beyond that lay only mystery and terror. Sailors spoke in hushed tones of boiling seas near the equator, where ships and their crews would surely burst into flames. They believed, truly believed, that the sun grew hotter as one sailed south, until eventually the ocean itself would boil, and any ship that ventured there would be consumed by fire. They whispered over their ale in dark taverns of sea monsters with tentacles that could wrap around entire ships, pulling them down to watery graves, of whirlpools that could swallow entire fleets, leaving no trace of their existence. But Prince Henry was undaunted. He had a vision, a dream that would not let him rest. He established a school of navigation in Sagres, bringing together the finest mapmakers from Italy, astronomers who could read the stars, and shipbuilders from across Europe who understood how to create vessels that could withstand the mighty ocean. Year after year, Portuguese ships ventured a little further south along the African coast. Each voyage brought back new knowledge, new maps carefully drawn, showing another 100 miles of coastline. New hope that somewhere beyond the horizon lay the sea route to the Indies. The progress was heartbreakingly slow. Decades passed, and still no Portuguese ship had found the southern tip of Africa. The continent seemed endless, stretching forever southward, mocking their efforts, their dreams. Sailors died from scurvy, a horrible disease that made their teeth fall out, their gums bleed, their bodies slowly fail them. Ships were lost to unknown rocks lurking beneath the waves and treacherous currents that could drive vessels onto shore or out into the open ocean, never to be seen again. Yet still, the dream persisted. Henry and the kings who followed him continued to send ships south, ever south, believing that eventually persistence would be rewarded. And then, in the year 1488, nearly 70 years after Henry the Navigator began his school, a Portuguese navigator named Bartolomeu Dias rounded the southern cape of Africa and gazed out upon waters that stretched toward the Indies. He had done it after decades of trying, of dying, of hoping. A Portuguese ship had finally reached the bottom of Africa. The way to the Indies was open. He named it the Cape of Storms for the terrible weather he had encountered there. Winds that howled like demons, waves that rose like mountains. But the Portuguese king, wise in the ways of public relations, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, for it represented hope itself, the hope of finally reaching the source of precious spices. But it would be another navigator, Vasco da Gama, who would complete the impossible journey, who would actually reach India by sea and return to tell the tale. Picture his fleet for small ships, tiny vessels to carry men across the world, provisions for months at sea, barrels of hardtack and salted meat, water in wooden casks that would soon turn green with algae, and a crew of 170 men, brave men, desperate men, men seeking fortune or fleeing poverty, many of whom would never see their homeland again. The journey around Africa and across the Indian Ocean to India took nearly a year, an entire year of sailing into the unknown, months of battling storms that could tear a ship apart in minutes, winds that could snap the strongest mast like a twig, weeks without sight of land, just endless ocean in every direction, the horizon unchanging day after day, until men began to wonder if they had sailed off the edge of the world into some kind of eternal limbo, subsisting on hard biscuits infested with weevils and water that had turned green with algae that tasted foul but was all they had. Eating rats when they could catch them, considering it a delicacy. The crew suffering from scurvy, their gums bleeding, their teeth falling out, loose in their sockets until chewing became agony. Their bodies slowly failing them, joints swelling, old wounds reopening, some begging Da Gama to turn back before they all perished in the endless ocean. But Da Gama, driven by visions of warehouses filled with pepper, by dreams of glory and wealth, by the knowledge that turning back would mean failure, pressed on until finally, after months of suffering, the coast of India appeared on the horizon. When his ships returned to Lisbon nearly 2 years after they had left, only 2 of the 4 ships made it home, and of the 170 men who had set out, only 54 returned. The rest, claimed by scurvy, by storms, by disease, by all the perils of the sea. But they carried cargo worth 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. 60 times. The profits were staggering beyond imagination. Black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves purchased directly from Indian merchants without paying a single coin to Venetian or Arab middlemen. The dream had been realized. The sea route to the Indies was open. The news of da Gama's success spread across Europe like wildfire. In every port, in every trading house, in every royal court, people spoke of nothing else. The Portuguese had found the sea route to the Indies. Venice's monopoly was broken forever, but da Gama's success would inspire another navigator whose miscalculation, whose fundamental error in geography would change the world in ways no one could have imagined. Christopher Columbus, convinced that the Earth was smaller than it actually was by about a third, believed he could reach the Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic. It would be shorter, he argued, than the Portuguese route around Africa. He too was driven by dreams of spices. In his letters to the Spanish crown, he promised to bring back ships laden with pepper and cinnamon and gold. He spoke of the riches that awaited, of the glory that would come to Spain if they would only fund his expedition. When Columbus finally convinced Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand to fund his expedition, after years of trying, of being rejected by court after court, he set sail with 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and visions of Spice Islands dancing in his head. Of course, Columbus never found the Spice Islands of his dreams. Instead, he stumbled upon an entirely new world, a world that Europeans had no idea existed, a world that would eventually provide Europe with its own revolutionary spice. The chili pepper, these bright red pods, unknown in the old world, never seen by European eyes, carried within them a heat and intensity that rivaled and in some ways surpassed the black pepper of India. Columbus, ever hopeful, ever convinced that he had found a new route to the Indies called the native peoples, Indians, and the spicy pods. He found peppers, names that persist to this day, despite being completely wrong, based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Though he never realized it, Columbus had discovered what would become one of the world's most important culinary treasures. Today, chili peppers are more widely used than black pepper adding heat and flavor to cuisines around the globe. But the ultimate prize in the spice world still lay in the distant tropical islands of Southeast Asia, a place that existed in European imagination as a kind of paradise where spices grew like weeds, where wealth lay waiting for those brave enough to find it. The Moluccas, known as the Spice Islands, a small archipelago lost in the vast Pacific Ocean, were home to the most precious spices of all. The spices that would drive men to risk everything. Nutmeg and mace grew on trees found nowhere else on Earth. Not in India, not in Africa, not in China, nowhere. Only in the Moluccas. And cloves, those tiny nail-shaped buds, grew only on a handful of remote islands in the same archipelago. These spices were so valuable that a single ship returning from the Moluccas, its hold filled with nutmeg and cloves, could fund an entire expedition, could pay for the loss of every other ship in the fleet, and still leave the investors wealthy beyond imagination. A handful of nutmeg could buy a house in London. A bag of cloves could purchase a title and land. These tiny seeds, these dried flower buds, represented wealth in its most concentrated form. It was this ultimate prize, this dream of unimaginable riches, that drove Ferdinand Magellan to attempt the most ambitious voyage in human history, a voyage that would circle the entire globe, that would prove once and for all that the Earth was round. Magellan, convinced the Spanish crown that he could reach the Spice Islands by sailing west around South America, thereby avoiding Portuguese-controlled waters. Spain and Portugal had divided the world between them in a treaty, and Magellan believed he could reach the Moluccas through Spanish territory. The journey would be unimaginably difficult, more difficult than anything ever attempted. No European had ever navigated around the southern tip of South America. No one knew if it was even possible, if there was a passage through the continent, or if South America, like Africa, simply went on forever. Magellan's fleet, 5 ships and 270 men, faced storms so violent that sailors lashed themselves to the masts with ropes to avoid being swept overboard into the churning black water, where they would die within minutes in the freezing cold. They battled through the treacherous strait that now bears Magellan's name, a maze of rocky channels and howling winds, where one wrong turn could mean destruction on jagged rocks, where the ship would be torn apart like paper. The strait seemed to go on forever, twisting, turning, branching into false channels that led nowhere, forcing them to backtrack, to try again, while their supplies dwindled and their patience wore thin. When they finally emerged into the Pacific Ocean, Magellan named it the Peaceful Ocean, for it seemed calm after the terrors of the strait. But they found not the narrow sea. They expected not the quick journey to the Spice Islands, but an ocean so vast that they would sail for months without seeing land. The crew began to starve. Their food supplies, carefully rationed, ran out. They ate leather from the ship's rigging, first soaking it in seawater, then boiling it for hours until it was somewhat edible, chewing the tough, salty substance until their jaws ached. They ate sawdust mixed with water to make it somewhat filling. They ate rats, paying half a gold coin for a single rat, considering it a delicacy, fighting over the privilege of eating vermin. Magellan himself would never see the Spice Islands. He was killed in the Philippines in a battle with local warriors, shot with arrows and speared, dying on a beach thousands of miles from home. His dream almost realized, but not quite. But his surviving crew, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, a Basque navigator who took control of the expedition, finally reached their destination. After years of sailing, after countless deaths, after losing almost everything, they finally reached the Moluccas. The Moluccas, imagine their wonder as they approached these legendary islands. Islands they had heard about, dreamed about for so long. The very air seemed to shimmer with the scent of cloves. Even from miles offshore, they could smell it, that distinctive sweet, spicy aroma that meant they had found paradise. Local merchants came out in small boats, outrigger canoes carved from single trees, to greet them, carrying bundles of precious spices that Europeans had dreamed about for centuries. These merchants had been trading with Asian merchants for generations, but European ships were still a novelty, a curiosity. The surviving crew, skeleton thin, their clothes in rags, their skin burned by sun and salt, loaded their single remaining ship, the Victoria, with cloves and nutmeg, filling every available space, knowing that these spices represented their salvation, their fortune, their justification for all the suffering. And then they began the long journey home, sailing west across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, up the coast of Africa, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Of the 270 men who had set out, only 18 returned. 18 men out of more than 200. The cost in human life was staggering, but the cargo they brought back was worth a fortune enough to consider the expedition a success. But more importantly, they had proven that the earth was round, that one could sail around the world, that the Spice Islands were real and could be reached by determined men. But knowledge of the location of the Spice Islands would soon attract the attention of the most ruthless and efficient trading nations in Europe. Nations that understood the value of monopoly and were willing to do anything to achieve it. The Dutch and the English, both nations, had grown wealthy through trade. The Dutch, through their location at the mouth of great rivers that brought goods from all over Europe. The English, through their wool trade and their growing maritime power, and both recognized that controlling the spice trade could make them the most powerful nations on earth. They formed what we would recognize today as the first multinational corporations. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, and the British East India Company, founded 2 years earlier, were granted extraordinary powers by their respective governments. These companies could wage war, raise armies, build fortresses, sign treaties with foreign powers, and rule over vast territories, all in the name of profit, all in the name of controlling the precious spice trade. They were states within states, with powers that no modern corporation could ever dream of. What followed was a period of brutal competition between these corporate empires. They built fortresses on remote islands, tiny specks of land. In the vast Pacific, maintained private armies of thousands of men and fought what amounted to corporate wars over the right to control tiny tropical islands, most of which appeared on no maps. The Dutch proved to be the most ruthless. They systematically eliminated their competition through a combination of military force, economic pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and sheer determination. They would stop at nothing to achieve their monopoly. Nowhere was this brutality more evident than in their treatment of the Banda Islands, the sole source of nutmeg and mace in the entire world. 10 tiny islands in the middle of nowhere that happened to be the only place on Earth where nutmeg trees grew naturally. The Dutch demanded that the Banda Islanders sell their entire nutmeg harvest exclusively to the Dutch East India Company. No other buyers would be permitted. The Dutch, and only the Dutch, would control every single nutmeg that left the islands. When the islanders, quite reasonably, wanted to trade with other nations as well, with the English, with the Portuguese, with Chinese merchants, as they had done for centuries, the Dutch response was swift and horrific. They would make an example that no one would forget. They systematically eliminated the population of the Banda Islands in what historians now recognize as genocide. Dutch soldiers, led by Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a man whose name deserves to live in infamy, killed or enslaved the entire population. Men, women, and children were killed or enslaved and transported to other Dutch colonies to live out their lives in bondage. Of the 15,000 people who lived on the Banda Islands, fewer than 1,000 survived. An entire culture, an entire people who had lived on those islands for thousands of years, who had cultivated and traded nutmeg since time immemorial, were wiped out in a matter of months. The Dutch then repopulate the islands with Dutch colonists and enslaved workers from other regions, from Java, from other Dutch possessions, creating a nutmeg plantation system that they could control completely. Every tree was numbered. Every harvest was recorded. Any islander caught with an unauthorized nutmeg could be executed on the spot. This genocide was committed entirely for the sake of maintaining a monopoly on nutmeg, a spice that today we casually sprinkle on our holiday eggnog, a spice that sits in our kitchen cabinets, barely used, forgotten for months at a time. The Dutch monopoly seemed unbreakable. For decades, they controlled the spice trade with an iron fist. They destroyed nutmeg and clove trees on islands they didn't control to ensure that production remained limited to their possessions. They patrolled the waters around the Spice Islands, capturing or sinking any ships that tried to trade without their permission. But monopolies, like empires, are not eternal, and sometimes they are broken by the most unlikely heroes, by men driven by principle, by curiosity, by a belief that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. Pierre Poivre, a French botanist whose very name meant pepper in French, an irony that was not lost on his contemporaries, would become the man who finally broke the Dutch spice monopoly. Poivre understood that the only way to break the Dutch stranglehold on the spice trade was to steal the spices themselves, not the dried seeds that were sold in markets. Those were useless for establishing new plantations. But the living plants, the seedlings, the saplings that could be grown elsewhere, that could break the geographic monopoly that the Dutch enjoyed. This was extraordinarily dangerous. The Dutch guarded their spice plantations like military installations, like fortresses, like treasuries. Anyone caught attempting to smuggle spice plants could be executed on the spot. No trial, no mercy, just immediate death as a warning to others. But Poivre was determined. He was driven not just by profit, though that was certainly a factor, but by a belief that the Dutch monopoly was morally wrong, that no nation should control the world's access to these plants, that knowledge and resources should be available to all. Over several years, he made multiple dangerous journeys to Dutch-controlled islands, traveling in secret, using false identities, bribing guards, befriending local workers, slowly, carefully, collecting spice seedlings and seeds. He hid nutmeg seedlings in false bottoms of shipping crates, carefully constructing compartments that would escape cursory inspection. He concealed clove saplings among other tropical plants in botanical collections, hoping that Dutch inspectors would not notice them among the dozens of other species. He wrapped precious seeds in wax to keep them viable, hiding them in his clothes, in his shoes, even swallowing them when necessary to get them past Dutch checkpoints. Each journey was a risk, each success a small victory in his private war against monopoly. Journey after journey, Poivre smuggled these precious plants to French colonies in the Indian Ocean, particularly the islands of Mauritius and Réunion, islands with similar climates, similar soil, where spice plants could potentially thrive. Slowly, patiently, often failing, watching seedlings wither and die, learning from his mistakes, trying again, he established spice plantations outside of Dutch control. For the first time in centuries, nutmeg and cloves were growing in places where the Dutch could not control them, could not destroy them, could not maintain their stranglehold. The impact was revolutionary as spice cultivation spread to French, British, and other colonial territories, as other botanists followed Poivre's example. As living plants found their way to plantations around the world, the Dutch monopoly began to crumble. Prices that had been artificially maintained at astronomical levels through careful control of supply began to fall. Not overnight, but gradually, inexorably, as more spices entered the market. Spices that had once been available only to the wealthy, to nobles and merchants, gradually became accessible to ordinary people. And so, as the 18th century gave way to the 19th, as the age of exploration gave way to the age of industrialization, the age of spice empires slowly came to an end. The same tiny seeds and fragrant bark that had launched 1,000 ships, that had driven men to sail around the world, that had toppled mighty empires and created new ones, began their transformation from treasures hoarded by kings to everyday kitchen staples found in every home. As cultivation spread across the tropical world, as steamships made transportation faster and cheaper, as the world grew smaller and more connected, spices became less precious, but perhaps more wonderful. For now, instead of being hoarded by the wealthy, locked away in silver boxes, they could become part of the daily lives of ordinary families. In India, where spices had always been abundant, where the spice trade had begun thousands of years ago. Turmeric and coriander, cumin and cardamom, black pepper and mustard seeds blended together to create the complex, fragrant mixtures we know as curry. Each region, each family had their own blend, their own secrets passed down through generations. In Mexico and throughout Latin America, chili peppers brought by Columbus from the Americas, those bright red pods that he had mistakenly called peppers, merged with European spices brought by conquistadors to create a cuisine of extraordinary depth and complexity. The heat of chilies combining with the warmth of cinnamon, the earthiness of cumin, creating flavors that were entirely new, entirely unique. In the kitchens of Thailand and Vietnam, of Indonesia and Malaysia, lemongrass and galangal star anise and cinnamon kaffir lime leaves and fish sauce combined to create flavors that seem to capture the very essence of tropical paradise. Each dish a perfect balance of sweet and sour, salty and spicy. Each bite a journey of flavors. Each culture, each region took these gifts from nature, these plants that had traveled thousands of miles, that had survived wars and storms, monopolies and empires, and made them their own, creating the diverse, beautiful, delicious world of flavors that we enjoy today. In Morocco and throughout North Africa, cinnamon and cumin, coriander and ginger mixed with preserved lemons and olives created tagines that simmered 4 hours, filling homes with their intoxicating aroma. In China, where spices had been used for thousands of years, star anise and Sichuan pepper, cassia bark, and cloves were blended into 5-spice powder, a mixture so perfectly balanced that it represented the 5 elements of Chinese philosophy: earth and water, fire and metal, and wood. And in Europe, where it had all begun, where the hunger for spices had driven the age of exploration, where men had risked everything for pepper and cinnamon, spices became commonplace. The merchants, who had once grown rich from the spice trade, turned their attention to other commodities, to sugar and coffee, to cotton and tea. The great trading companies that had once fought wars over tiny islands began to focus on other forms of commerce, eventually transforming or dissolving entirely as the world moved on to new obsessions, new treasures. But the legacy of the spice trade remained. The routes that had been opened in search of pepper became the highways of global trade. The connections that had been forged between East and West, between Europe and Asia, between the old world and the new, remained and deepened. And so, our journey through time comes to its gentle conclusion. We have traveled thousands of years from ancient Mesopotamia to the modern world. We have sailed with Arab traders across scorching deserts, with Portuguese navigators around the Cape of Good Hope, with Magellan's crew around the entire globe. These tiny, humble fragments of bark and seed and leaf that began as mysterious treasures from distant lands, guarded by myths of dragons and giant birds, have become the thread that connects our modern world. Tonight, when you sit down to dinner, you carry with you the legacy of ancient Egyptian priests burning incense to their gods, sending prayers up to the heavens in fragrant smoke. You share in the dreams of Roman matrons grinding precious pepper in their marble kitchens, believing that these tiny seeds held the secret to eternal youth. You are connected to medieval crusaders carrying small pouches of cinnamon across dangerous roads, bringing the taste of paradise back to Europe, and to Venetian merchants building palaces from the profits of the spice trade, creating a city of impossible beauty from pepper and cloves. Every time you season your food, you participate in the same ancient human desire that sent Portuguese navigators around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, braving storms that could destroy their tiny ships, and Spanish explorers across unknown oceans, sailing for months without sight of land, driven by dreams of distant islands where spices grew. You honor the memory of the Banda Islanders, who paid the ultimate price for growing nutmeg on their islands. You benefit from the courage of Pierre Poivre, who risked his life to break a monopoly that had enslaved entire populations. The story of spices is really the story of us, our curiosity about the world beyond our borders, our ambition to achieve great things, to overcome impossible obstacles, our willingness to risk everything for the sake of something beautiful, something delicious, something that makes life worth living. It is the story of human connection across vast distances and cultural differences, of how different peoples, different civilizations found ways to connect, to trade, to share, despite speaking different languages, despite worshiping different gods, despite having completely different ways of life. It is the story of how simple, natural gifts, plants that grow quietly in tropical forests, can bring the entire world together, one delicious meal at a time. So rest now and let your dreams carry you to spice gardens in distant lands where cinnamon bark peels away like ancient parchment, revealing the sweet, fragrant layers beneath, where pepper vines climb toward tropical suns, their berries slowly ripening from green to red to black. Dream of nutmeg trees growing slowly for decades before they bear their first fruit, of clove trees covered in tiny buds that must be picked at exactly the right moment before they bloom into flowers. Dream of merchant ships sailing peacefully across calm seas, their holds filled with treasures that will bring joy and flavor to kitchens around the world, of markets bustling with life where people from every nation come together to trade, to talk, to share the gifts of the earth. For in the end, this is what the spice trade truly gave us. Not just exotic flavors for our food, not just the wealth of nations, but a reminder that the world is connected in ways both beautiful and mysterious. That small, simple things like a seed, a flower, a piece of bark can have extraordinary power to change the course of history, to connect distant peoples, to make life richer, more delicious, more worth living. And that sometimes the greatest adventures, the most important journeys, the most profound discoveries begin with the smallest seeds, with simple curiosity about what lies beyond the horizon, with a desire to taste something different, something exotic, something that reminds us that the world is larger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. So sleep well now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your body relax completely, sinking into soft comfort. Let the story of these ancient spices, these tiny seeds that changed the world, carry you gently into peaceful, restful sleep. May your dreams be filled with the scent of cinnamon and the warmth of ginger. May you sail on calm seas, under starlit skies, toward distant islands where treasures await. Sleep well, and may your dreams be seasoned with wonder, with peace, with the gentle knowledge that you are connected to thousands of years of human history, to countless people who came before, who dreamed and dared and discovered. Rest now in peace and comfort,